I sat at the long glass table while everyone else talked over me. Vanessa stood at the head of the room, confident, sharp, untouchable. My fiancée. My boss. She didn't look at me when I raised my hand. Next slide, she said. I lowered my hand. Ethan leaned toward me and whispered, "You good?" "I'm fine," I said. Vanessa clicked her pen. "We don't need extra opinions right now." Extra opinions. That's what my ideas were. Extra. I watched the numbers on the screen and kept quiet. People nodded at her words. No one asked why the data looked off. No one asked why my report wasn't mentioned. After the meeting, Vanessa stopped me near the door. "You didn't need to speak," she said softly, smiling for others. "I had a suggestion," I replied. She tilted her head. And I didn't share it." "Good," she said. "You know your place." That word stayed with me. Later in the hallway, Ethan said, "Man, she cuts you off every time." I shrugged. "She's busy. She's rude." Lily walked past with her tablet. She glanced at me with that look again. Pity. I hated that look more than Vanessa's voice. At lunch, Vanessa sat across from me. "You were quiet today." "I listen," I said. She laughed lightly. "You always did. That's why this works." "What works?" I asked. She leaned closer. "You stay comfortable. I handle pressure." I nodded. Inside, I counted her words. Every one of them. That night at home, she corrected me while I cooked. "You're chopping that wrong." "It still cooks," I said. She sighed. "You'd struggle without me." I smiled. "Probably." She kissed my cheek. "At least you know." In bed, she scrolled her phone. "The board likes strong leaders." "I know." "You don't like attention," she added. "I don't chase it." She smirked. "Good." The next morning, Ethan stopped by my desk. "You ever think of pushing back?" "No," I said. He blinked. "Never?" I looked at my screen. "Why would I?" Lily dropped files near me. "Vanessa wants these revised." "Again?" She said your formatting confuses people. I thanked her. She hesitated. "You're smarter than this." "Am I?" She didn't answer. That afternoon, Vanessa called me into her office. "Sit." I sat. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "I always am." She studied me. "You're lucky." "Because of you?" "Yes," she said. "Without me, you'd still be invisible." I nodded. "I know." She smiled, satisfied. "That's honesty." When I left, my hands were steady. My mind wasn't. I wasn't invisible. I was unseen on purpose. At the coffee machine, Ethan said, "She treats you like an intern." "I let her," I replied. "Why?" I looked at my cup. "Because people reveal more when they think you're harmless." He frowned. "You're strange." I smiled. "I know." That evening, I stayed late. The office was quiet. I passed Vanessa's door and heard her voice. She was laughing. "I swear," she said into her phone, "he'd be lost without me." I stopped walking. "He's sweet," she continued, "but weak. I need someone like that." I leaned against the wall. "Control is easier when they don't push back," she said. "He won't." She laughed again. I waited until the call ended, then stepped away. My face didn't change. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. Because it confirmed everything. At home, she asked, "Why are you smiling?" "Long day," I said. She wrapped her arms around me. "You're safe with me." I held her. "I know." She didn't feel my heartbeat slow. In bed, she slept fast. I stared at the ceiling. They thought I was soft because I stayed quiet. They thought I was small because I stayed still. They thought I depended on her because I let her lead. But silence is not weakness. Waiting is not fear. And observation is not submission. I had learned her habits, her pressure points, her pride. I knew when she lied. I knew when she panicked. I knew what she feared most, being replaced. I turned on my side and closed my eyes. Tomorrow I would still be quiet. Tomorrow I would still nod. Tomorrow I would still let them look down on me. Because the best place to hide is beneath expectations. And when Vanessa finally looked at me differently, it would already be too late. I sat in the conference room while Vanessa paced in front of the screen talking about growth and vision and control. Everyone watched her. No one watched me. I kept my hands folded and my mouth shut. Inside, my thoughts were loud and angry and sharp. I wanted to say she was wrong. I wanted to say she stole my idea. I wanted to stand up and take back my voice. Instead, I stared at the table and breathed slow. Ethan shifted beside me and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded without looking. My jaw ached from holding back words that burned. She kept talking, voice steady, eyes sharp. I thought, you only sound strong because no one challenges you. I thought, you need me more than you know. I thought I could end this right now. My face stayed calm. Vanessa stopped mid-sentence and looked straight at me. What? She snapped. The room froze. I blinked. Nothing, I said. Her eyes narrowed. Don't look at me like that. I met her stare. Like what? I asked. She hesitated. Like you know something. Ethan sucked in a breath. Lily stiffened at her desk. I felt a chill. My thoughts had stayed inside. Vanessa laughed, but it was tight. If you have something to say, say it. I shook my head. I'm listening. She stared harder. No, you're not. The room stayed silent. Rachel glanced up from her notes. Dr. Miller shifted his chair. Vanessa pointed at me. You think I'm wrong? I said, no. She stepped closer. You're judging me. I replied, I'm not. Her voice rose. You are. I kept still. I'm just here. She laughed again, sharper. That's the problem. The word hung. I watched her hands shake. No one spoke. The air felt thin. I counted my breaths. She turned away suddenly. After the meeting, she grabbed my arm. My office, she said. I followed. She closed the door hard. What was that? She demanded. What was what? I asked. Don't play dumb. I tilted my head. I'm not. She crossed her arms. You were thinking things. I raised a brow. Thinking is allowed. Her lips pressed tight. Not against me. I smiled slightly. I didn't. She leaned in. You did. I met her eyes. Prove it. She froze. I felt the shift. Her control slipped. I stayed calm. Are you okay? I asked. Her breath hitched. Don't do that. I asked. Do what? She looked. She rubbed her temples. You're acting strange. I said, am I? She nodded. You're quiet in a different way. I shrugged. People change. She snapped. Not you. I smiled. Maybe you don't know me. That made her flinch. Don't turn this on me. I replied, I'm not. She paced. You think you're smarter than me? I said, no. She stopped. Then why did I feel that? I asked, feel what? Her eyes darted. Like you were judging me. I leaned back. That's in your head. Dr. Miller knocked lightly and opened the door. Everything okay? Vanessa snapped, yes. I said, of course. Dr. Miller studied us. You seem tense. Vanessa forced a smile. Long day. He nodded. Stress shows in leadership. She stiffened. He added, it's normal to feel threatened. Her eyes flashed. By what? He gestured gently. Change. I said, change can be good. Vanessa shot me a look. Dr. Miller smiled. Exactly. He left. Silence returned. Vanessa whispered, did you plan that? I blinked. Plan what? She shook her head. Nothing. I said, if you say so. She stared. You're enjoying this. I answered, I'm just here. She looked away again. Rachel passed by the door and frowned at Vanessa. Rachel stopped. Is there an issue? Vanessa said, no. I said, we're fine. Rachel looked between us. Okay. When she left, Vanessa hissed, why did you answer? I replied, because you were silent. She clenched her fists. You're testing me. I said, I'm not. She stepped closer. You think you're in control? I shook my head. No, she whispered, I am. I met her gaze. Then why are you scared? Her breath caught. I'm not scared. I said, your hands say otherwise. She looked down quickly. I smiled. She snapped, stop that. I asked, stop what? She turned away again. I stayed. That night, I walked past her office again. The door was open. She was on the phone. He knows, she said. I paused. No, I can tell. He thinks he's smarter than me. I leaned closer. I feel it. I heard her breath shake. He can't be. I smiled. She whispered, I'm losing him. I stepped back. She didn't see me. I went to the elevator. My phone buzzed. Ethan texted, she okay? I typed, she's cracking. He replied, be careful. I wrote, always am. The doors closed. I watched the numbers drop. My heart stayed slow. The game had. At home, she watched me from the couch. What were you thinking today? She asked. I said, about work. She pressed. About me? I replied, sometimes. She leaned forward. What kind of sometimes? I smiled. Normal ones. She searched my face. You're hiding. I said, you taught me well. That line hit her. What does that mean? I shrugged. You like control. She stiffened. Everyone does. I said, not like you. Her eyes darkened. Careful. I met her stare. Always am. Silence fell. She stood and walked away. I stayed seated. The room felt smaller. My smile stayed. She didn't see. In bed she lay stiff beside me. You're different, she said. I answered, people change. She whispered, I don't like it. I replied, you don't have to. She turned toward me. You belong to me. I looked at the ceiling. Do I? She propped up. Yes. I said, that's a dangerous thought. She froze. What did you say? I repeated, nothing. She stared. You're doing it again. I asked, doing what? Her voice shook. Thinking against me. I smiled softly. That's in your head. She rolled away. I closed my eyes. My mind was clear. Her control was not. Over. I typed, on my way. No emoji. No apology. When I walked into the office, she was already standing near my desk. Her arms were crossed. Her jaw was tight. You're late, she said. I was early yesterday, I replied. Her eyes narrowed. That's not how it works. I sat down calmly. It worked yesterday. She leaned closer. Don't get smart. I looked up at her. I'm not. She searched my face like she was looking for something hidden. You're different. I shrugged. You said people change. She pressed her lips together. Not you. Ethan passed by and whispered, she's watching you. I know, I said. Vanessa snapped. What did you say? Good morning, I replied. She didn't smile. An hour later, she messaged me asking why my screen was angled away. I didn't answer. 10 minutes after that, she appeared at my desk. Who are you texting? She asked. No one, I said. She pointed. Let me see. I unlocked my phone and handed it over without hesitation. She scrolled too fast, too nervous. When she found nothing, her face tightened. You cleared it, she accused. I didn't, I said. She stared. You're hiding something. I smiled gently. You always think that. She dropped my phone on the desk and walked away stiffly. Lily passed me a file. She asked me if you talk about her. I kept my voice low. What did you say? That you barely talk at all, she whispered. Be careful. I nodded. Thank you. At the meeting, Vanessa interrupted me 3 times before I finished a sentence. That's not relevant, she said. It is, I replied calmly. She blinked. Excuse me? It is relevant, I repeated. The room went quiet. Ethan stared at me. Lily froze. Rachel looked up. Vanessa laughed, but it sounded wrong. You don't get to decide that. I tilted my head. Then why ask? Her face twitched. After the meeting, Ethan grabbed my arm. What are you doing? Working, I said. She's losing it, he warned. I nodded. I see. He lowered his voice. She checked your email this morning. I raised an eyebrow. Without asking? Yes. I smiled. That's new. Not in a good way, he said. Lily stopped me near the copier. She asked if you're loyal. I looked at her. What did you say? I said yes, she replied. But she didn't believe me. I thanked her. I appreciate it. She hesitated. You're not weak, are you? I met her eyes. No. Her mouth parted slightly. I knew it. Vanessa called me into her office again. She closed the door hard. Sit, she said. I sat. Give me your phone, she demanded. I placed it on the desk. Your laptop, she said. I slid it over. She searched both in silence. Her breathing was fast. Her hands shook. You think I don't notice, she said. Notice what? I asked. You pulling away, she snapped. I'm right here. She slammed the desk. You're not. I didn't flinch. You seem stressed. Her eyes flashed. Don't patronize me. I'm not, I said. I'm concerned. She laughed sharply. You don't get to be concerned about me. I leaned back. Why not? Because I'm in charge, she said. I nodded. Of work. And you, she added. I looked at her. Are you? She froze. What? She said. I smiled faintly. You said you were in charge of me. She swallowed. You belong to me. I held her gaze. That's an interesting way to describe a fiancé. Her face tightened. You're testing me? I shook my head. I'm answering you. She paced. You're enjoying this. I'm listening, I replied. She stopped. Why don't you fight back? I asked. Why do you want me to? She stared. Because it proves you care. I said softly, or it proves you need control. Her breath caught. You don't get to say that. I met her eyes. You don't get to own me. She stepped back like I'd hit her. Rachel knocked. Everything okay? Vanessa snapped. Yes. I said, we're just talking. Rachel hesitated. You seem upset. Vanessa forced a smile. I'm fine. Rachel looked at me. I gave a small nod. She left. Vanessa whispered, You're turning them against me. I replied, You're doing that yourself. She pointed. You planted this. I asked, Planted what? Doubt, she said. I tilted my head. You doubt yourself? She clenched her fists. Stop. Stop what? I asked. Being calm, she snapped. I smiled. You taught me. Her eyes burned. I should never have built you. I answered, You didn't. Silence dropped between us. She looked small in that moment. Not weak. Afraid. Later, in the hallway, she raised her voice at me in front of everyone. Fix it, she said sharply. I will, I replied. Now, she ordered. I nodded. Of course. People watched. I felt their eyes. I felt her need to dominate. Ethan whispered, She's humiliating you. I met his gaze. I know. He shook his head. Why are you smiling? I looked back at Vanessa, who was watching me like a hawk. Because she's showing everyone who she is. At my desk, Lily passed me a note. It read, She's scared. I wrote back, Good? Vanessa hovered. You're too quiet. I said, You like quiet. She snapped, Not like this. I looked up. Like what? She opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have an answer. At the end of the day, she announced a correction to my work in front of the whole team. She made it sound like a mistake. It wasn't. She smiled while she did it. People shifted. No one spoke. I nodded. Thank you for the feedback. Her eyes flickered. Inside, I thanked her. Because now they saw it. And once people see, they never unsee. I closed the office door and said, We need to talk. She didn't look up. About what? She asked. About us, I replied. She sighed. Make it quick. I smiled. You always do. She glanced at me. Is that attitude? I said, It's honesty. She leaned back. You're being dramatic. I said, You're being familiar. She crossed her arms. I built you. I asked, Did you? She said, Your ideas were raw. I replied, You polished them and signed your name. She laughed. That's leadership. I said, That's theft. She stood. Careful. I said, Soft doesn't mean silent. She narrowed her eyes. You owe me. I asked, For loving me? She answered, For making you relevant. I said, You made me smaller. She snapped, I made you safe. I whispered, You made you feel big. She slammed the desk. I will not be talked to like this. I said, Then don't talk to me like property. She froze. Property? I nodded. You say, Mine like a title. She scoffed. You're engaged to me. I replied, Not owned by you. She stepped closer. Without me you disappear. I said, Without you I breathe. Her jaw tightened. You're trying to hurt me. I said, I'm trying to be seen. She laughed sharp. You're nothing without my name. I answered, I am my work. She shook her head. I took risks for you. I said, You took credit. She pointed. I protected you. I replied, You controlled me. She whispered, Because I love you. I said, Because you fear losing me. She flinched. Don't psychoanalyze me. I said, Then stop proving me right. She paced. You think you're a partner? I answered, I thought I was. She snapped, Your support. I said, I'm not a ladder. She laughed. You climb because I lifted. I replied, I climb because I worked. She raised her voice. You'd fail alone. I kept mine low. You'd be exposed. She stopped. What does that mean? I smiled. It means I wrote the plan you pitched. She blinked. You're lying. I said, Ask Marcus. She stiffened. He doesn't know. I said, He does. A knock came. Marcus stepped in. Sorry to interrupt, he said. Vanessa smiled tight. We're busy. I said, we're clarifying. Marcus looked at me. About the pipeline proposal? I nodded. Yes. Vanessa cut in. I handled that. I said, I drafted it. Marcus raised his brows. You did. I answered, every model. Vanessa laughed. He assisted. I said, I authored. Marcus studied her. We'll review the files. Vanessa's smile faltered. There's no need. I said, there is. Marcus nodded. Send me the originals. Vanessa said, I'll send mine. I replied, I'll send mine. Marcus paused. Good. He left. The door clicked. Silence stretched. She whispered, you betrayed me. I said, you replaced me. She shouted, I elevated you. I said, you diminished me. She threw her hands up. You needed me. I replied, you needed control. She glared. You're ungrateful. I said, I'm awake. She trembled. I gave you love. I answered, you gave me rules. She cried, I kept you safe. I said, you kept me small. She lunged closer. Say you're sorry. I said, I'm done apologizing. She slapped the desk. You belong to me. I looked at her. I never did. Her breath stuttered. You're leaving. I said, I'm standing. She shook her head. You're breaking us. I replied, you broke us. She sank into her chair. I can't lose you. I said, you never had me. She covered her face. I made you. I said, you shaped the cage. She peeked. Why are you so calm? I answered, because I'm free. She whispered, without me you're nothing. I said, without you I'm honest. She stood again, eyes wild. I will end you. I said softly, you can try. She recoiled. Who are you? I smiled. The man you tried to own. The door opened. Marcus returned with Rachel. Everything all right? He asked. Vanessa said, yes. I said, no. Marcus looked at her. Your team is uneasy. She snapped, they're loyal. I said, they're observant. Rachel added, concerns are rising. Vanessa pointed at me. Because of him. I said, because of you. Marcus held up a hand. We'll review leadership. Vanessa laughed hollow. You can't. I replied, watch. She stared at me shocked. You planned this. I said, you taught me. Marcus said, we'll follow process. Vanessa whispered, he's mine. I said, he's not. Rachel frowned. Ownership language is troubling. Vanessa's face drained. This is a misunderstanding. I said, it's a pattern. Marcus nodded. We'll meet tomorrow. They left. She slumped. You humiliated me. I said, you taught me how. She looked up. Why now? I answered, because I finally heard myself. She whispered, you loved me. I said, I did. She asked, and now? I replied, now I love me. She cried. I didn't move. I realized I was never her partner, only her possession, and I felt the chain fall. I breathed once and said, this ends here. She shook her head and whispered, you'll come back. I answered, no. She reached for my hand and said, we were a team. I replied, you were the captain. She pleaded, I can change. I said, you won't. She asked, is this revenge? I answered, it's release. She stood, I made sacrifices. I said, so did I. She cried, you owe me. I said, I owe myself. She stepped closer, stay. I said, watch me go. She whispered, you're cruel? I replied, I'm clear. She said, they'll fail without me. I answered, they'll grow. She asked, do you hate me? I said, I don't trust you. She covered her mouth, I loved you. I said, you loved control. She turned away, I'm scared. I said, so am I. She looked back, then don't leave. I replied, then let me lead. She shook her head, you can't. I said, I already am. She fell silent. I opened the door. I didn't look back. I walked into the boardroom with my folder closed and my back straight. Vanessa was already there, tapping her pen and scanning faces. Marcus sat at the center, calm and unreadable. Lily stood by the screen with a small smile she tried to hide. Ethan slipped into the chair beside me and whispered, good luck. I nodded and kept my eyes forward. Vanessa cleared her throat. Let's begin, she said, already reaching for the remote. I raised my hand. She froze. Yes, she asked tight. I'll take this, I said standing. A ripple moved through the room. Vanessa laughed once. You, she said. I looked at Marcus. He nodded. Go ahead, he said. Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I stepped to the screen and turned it on. This model, I said, shows the risk you're missing. Vanessa cut in. That's not finalized, she snapped. I didn't look at her. It's complete, I said. Marcus leaned forward. Explain, he said. I pointed to the graph. When we scale here, margins drop, I said. Vanessa shook her head. That's incorrect, she said. I met her eyes. It's not, I replied. Rachel scribbled notes. Lily smiled. Ethan stared. Vanessa raised her voice. You didn't clear this with me, she said. I stayed calm. I don't need permission to share my work, I said. A few people murmured. Marcus lifted a hand. Let him finish, he said. Vanessa's jaw tightened. I clicked to the next slide. This is the revenue path, I said. Vanessa leaned toward Marcus. He's misrepresenting, she whispered. Marcus didn't look at her. Continue, he said. I spoke steadily. For the first time I didn't shrink, I thought. Vanessa interrupted. This is a waste of time, she said. No one reacted. I waited. The silence stretched. Lily glanced at me and nodded. Ethan mouthed, wow. I continued. If we follow the current plan we lose leverage, I said. Vanessa snapped, stop. Marcus raised his voice. Do not interrupt, he said. Vanessa blinked. I saw fear. It didn't move me. I finished the explanation. Questions? I asked. Rachel lifted her hand. This aligns with what we've been seeing, she said. Marcus nodded. Why wasn't this presented before? He asked. Vanessa inhaled sharply. He never shared it, she said. I replied, I sent it twice. Marcus turned to her. Did you review it? He asked. She hesitated. I was busy, she said. I added, you told me it wasn't relevant. A few heads turned. Vanessa's face flushed. Marcus said, we will discuss leadership process. Vanessa whispered, you're undermining me. I looked at her. I'm contributing, I said. She shook her head. You planned this, she said. I answered, I prepared. Marcus closed his folder. Good work, he said to me. Lily beamed. Ethan whispered, they're listening. Vanessa stood abruptly. This meeting is over, she said. Marcus replied, no, it isn't. She froze. I felt the shift. It was quiet. My chest felt open. I didn't feel small. I felt clear. Marcus addressed the room. We will review all submissions going forward, he said. Vanessa sat slowly. Her eyes never left me. I met them. She whispered, you think you won. I replied softly, I think I started. She clenched her jaw. Lily leaned in. I'm proud of you, she whispered. I nodded. Ethan grinned. Vanessa stood again. After this, my office, she said. I answered, schedule it. She stared. Marcus said, we're done here. Chairs moved. People stood. Vanessa watched me as the room emptied. Her control had cracked. I felt it. Outside, Ethan clapped my shoulder. Who are you? He asked. I smiled. The same man, I said. Lily walked beside me. You were brilliant, she said. I replied, I was honest. Vanessa's door slammed behind us. Ethan laughed. She's panicking, he said. I breathed in. For the first time, the air felt mine. I checked my watch. Coffee? Ethan asked. Sure, I said. Lily smiled again. As we walked, I heard Vanessa call my name. I didn't turn. Not because I was angry. Because I was done being small. I kept walking. My steps felt steady. My voice felt ready. My future felt open. I didn't look back. Ethan said, she's going to come after you. I replied, she already is. Lily added, we'll back you. I thanked her. We reached the elevator. The doors opened. Vanessa stood inside. Her eyes were bright and sharp. Ethan froze. Lily inhaled. Vanessa smiled thin. Going somewhere? She asked. Coffee, I said. She looked at Lily. You, she said, stay. Lily glanced at me. I shook my head. She's with me, I said. Vanessa's smile vanished. You don't give orders, she said. I replied, neither do you. Ethan's mouth opened. Lily's eyes widened. Vanessa laughed brittle. You're playing a game, she said. I answered, I'm playing fair. She stepped closer. Get in, she said. I didn't move. Ethan whispered, "We can take the stairs." I shook my head again. "We're good," I said. Vanessa stared at me. Her breathing changed. I saw it. Fear. She turned to Lily. "You think he's better than me?" she asked. Lily said, "I think he's honest." Vanessa flinched. I said, "That's enough." She pointed at me. "You will regret this," she said. I replied, "I regret staying small." The elevator chimed. Doors tried to close. Vanessa blocked them. Marcus's voice came from behind. "Vanessa," he said, "step aside." She turned. Her face drained again. "Marcus," she said. He looked at me. "Good presentation," he said. "Thank you," I replied. He addressed her. "Let them go," he said. She moved slowly. The doors closed. Inside, Ethan exhaled. Lily smiled at me. I smiled back. The elevator descended. My phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. "You're making a mistake." I typed, "I'm making a choice." Sent. Ethan asked, "You okay?" I nodded. I answered her call on the third ring. "Why are you ignoring me?" she asked. "I'm not," I said. "You didn't reply," she snapped. "I was working," I replied. "You're avoiding me," she said. "No," I said, "I'm busy." She laughed weakly. "Busy without me." I paused. "Yes." She inhaled. "We need to talk." I said, "Send an invite." She whispered, "Don't be cold." I answered, "Don't be dramatic." She sighed. "You're punishing me." I replied, "I'm focusing." She went quiet. Then she cried. "I'm losing you." I said, "You're losing control." She choked. "You're cruel." I answered, "I'm steady." She snapped, "You owe me." I said, "I owe myself." She raised her voice. "After everything I did." I asked, "For me or for you?" She said, "For us." I replied, "We were never us." She gasped. "That's not fair." I said, "Neither was ownership." She hung up. My phone buzzed again. It was Nina. "We should meet," she said. "Why?" I asked. "Because she's not okay," Nina replied. "You mean Vanessa?" I said. "Yes," she said, "and she's spiraling." I said, "I can see that." Nina lowered her voice. She called me crying. I asked, "About work?" Nina said, "About you." I paused. "What did she say?" Nina answered, "That you're abandoning her." I replied, "I'm not." Nina said, "She thinks you are." I asked, "Why are you telling me?" Nina said, "Because she's unstable." I said, "That's not my job." Nina sighed. "I know, but it's getting bad." I asked, "How bad?" Nina said, "Threats." I went still. "What kind?" Nina said, "Career. Reputation." I said, "She already tried." Nina whispered, "She's desperate." I said, "Thank you for the warning." Nina replied, "Be careful." I answered, "Always." At the office she hovered. "Did you get my messages?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Then answer," she demanded. "I will," I replied. "When?" she asked. "When there's something to answer," I said. She stared. "You're freezing me out." I said, "You're heating yourself up." She laughed, then cried. "I gave you everything." I replied, "You took it." She grabbed my sleeve. "Don't do this." I said, "Let go." She tightened her grip. "Stay." I said, "No," she whispered, "Please?" I met her eyes. "Not like this." She shook. "I can change." I said, "You won't." She snapped, "I will." I replied, "Prove it." She opened her mouth and closed it. "I'm trying," she said. I answered, "Try alone." She gasped. "You can't leave." I said, "Watch me." She blocked my path. "I'll ruin you." I looked at her. "Document that," I said. Rachel stood behind us. Vanessa froze. Rachel said, "I heard that." Vanessa stammered. "I was joking." I said, "She wasn't." Rachel wrote. Vanessa's face went pale. By lunch she was pacing. "Why won't you look at me?" she asked. "I am," I said. "No, you're not," she replied. "You're gone." I said, "I'm here." She slammed her hand on the counter. "Say you need me." I answered, "I don't." She laughed. "You're lying." I said, "I'm clear." She whispered, "You're breaking me." I replied, "You're breaking yourself." She cried harder. "I can breathe." I said, "Sit." She Saturday talk, she begged. I said, listen. She said, I love you. I answered, you love control. She shook her head. That's not true. I said, it is. She covered her face. I'm scared. I replied, so am I. She peeked. Then help me. I said, help yourself. She slammed the chair back. You're heartless. I said, I'm honest. She shouted, everyone will hate you. I replied, they already see you. She froze. What did you say? I said, the truth. She whispered, they're turning. I answered, they're watching. She grabbed her bag. I'm calling Marcus. I said, do. She ran. An hour later Rachel emailed me. Please save any messages, she wrote. I replied, saved. Ethan stopped by. She yelled at the team, he said. Who? I asked. Everyone, he replied. She blamed you. I nodded. Of course. He frowned. Are you okay? I said, yes. He whispered, she's not. I asked, what happened? He said, she canceled a contract. I blinked. Which one? He answered, the biggest. I paused. Why? He said, because she thought it was mine. I smiled. It wasn't. He shook his head. She's making bad calls. I replied, fear does that. He asked, should we tell Marcus? I said, he'll find out. Ethan studied me. You're cold? I said, I'm clear. He sighed. Be careful. I nodded. Always. Vanessa cornered me near the stairs. I'll do anything, she said. Name it. I replied, stop. She shook. I can't. I said, then move. She grabbed my tie. Don't leave me. I looked at her hand. Release. She cried. Please. I waited. She let go. I hate you, she whispered. I said, you hate losing. She glared. I'll expose you. I replied, with what? She faltered. You think you're safe. I answered, I think you're seen. She slapped the wall. I built this. I said, you broke it. She slid down. I need you. I said, you need help. She looked up. From you. I replied, from a therapist. She laughed weakly. You're mocking me. I said, I'm protecting me. She stared. You're done. I answered, we are. She whispered, I can't breathe. I said, open the door. She opened it. I walked. Later Nina texted, she's with me. I replied, good. Nina wrote, she's crying. I answered, she needs help. Nina said, she wants you. I replied, she needs herself. Nina paused, then sent, I warned you. I typed, thank you. Nina asked, are you safe? I said, yes. Nina wrote, she's not. I answered, she will be. I put my phone down and did nothing. I didn't chase. I didn't explain. I didn't rescue. The company watched. Rachel wrote. Marcus listened. Vanessa unraveled. I stayed still and that was enough. Silence became my shield, patience my weapon, and her desperation my unavoidable ending at last. I sat outside the boardroom while voices rose inside and fell again, and Ethan leaned close and whispered, they're calling everyone. I nodded and said, good. Lily squeezed my arm and said, stay calm. I answered, I am. The door opened and Rachel waved us in. Marcus looked serious and said, we will proceed. Vanessa stared at me as if I had written the agenda. I met her eyes and said, I'm ready. She scoffed, of course you are. I replied, so are the facts. The room went quiet and every chair turned toward me in steady silence, now alone. Marcus cleared his throat and said, this is an inquiry, not a trial. Vanessa laughed and said, he's dramatic. I replied, I'm documented. Rachel slid a file and said, threats recorded. Vanessa snapped, out of context. Ethan stood and said, I heard them. Lily added, so did I. Marcus nodded and said, proceed. I told the timeline and kept my voice level. Vanessa tried to interrupt, but Marcus raised a hand. She whispered, you planned this. I said, you forced this. The room murmured and pens moved as notes filled pages across the long table, quietly now for once alone. Vanessa leaned forward and said, you're betraying me. I answered, I'm testifying. Marcus asked, did you access his email? She said, for safety. Rachel replied, without consent. Vanessa glared and said, he belongs to me. The room stiffened. I said, "No." Ethan exhaled. Lily shook her head. Marcus wrote something and said, "Language matters." Vanessa whispered, "They're turning." I replied, "They're seeing." She laughed brittle and said, "You were nothing." I met her gaze and said, "I was quiet." Chairs shifted again and eyes dropped across the room in slow waves now as silence grew heavy again on us both. Marcus called a break and people stood, but Vanessa stayed seated and stared at me. She said, "Look at what you did." I replied, "Look at what you said." She shook her head and said, "They'll forget." I answered, "Records don't." Rachel passed and whispered, "Keep going." Lily smiled and said, "We're with you." Ethan said, "Tell them everything." I nodded. Vanessa muttered, "Traitor." I said, "Witness." She laughed and said, "You think you won." I replied, "I think you're heard." The door closed and the hallway fell quiet as steps faded and breath slowed around us again now alone. When we returned, Marcus said, "Findings will be shared." Vanessa stood and tried to speak but Rachel said, "Not now." She flushed. I felt steady. Marcus asked me, "Any additions?" I said, "Just dates." Ethan handed files. Lily nodded. Vanessa whispered, "Stop." I replied, "No." Marcus read and said, "This is serious." Vanessa laughed and said, "He's petty." I said, "I'm precise." The board members exchanged looks. The screen lit with timelines. Vanessa's smile collapsed as each line appeared across the display in clean rows and steady order now that left no room for doubt at all any longer now. Marcus asked, "Do you deny these entries?" Vanessa shook her head and said, "They're misread." Rachel replied, "They are exact." Lily said, "I saw it." Ethan added, "I reported it." Vanessa whispered, "You set me up." I said, "You set yourself." Marcus wrote again and said, "We will proceed." Vanessa stood and said, "This is unfair." I replied, "So was ownership." She gasped. The room froze. Marcus looked at her and said, "Sit." She sat slowly, eyes wet, hands trembling on the edge of the chair as silence pressed down hard and every breath sounded loud to me now alone. During questions, Vanessa tried to joke but no one laughed. She tried to charm but eyes stayed cold. She tried to blame me and Marcus said, "Enough." I watched her shrink without moving. Lily touched my sleeve and said, "You're okay?" I nodded. Ethan whispered, "It's over." I said, "It's truth." Rachel asked for statements. I spoke once. Vanessa spoke twice and contradicted herself. Pens paused. Heads tilted. The tone changed. The power moved. I felt nothing, and that was everything in the quiet space between words and breaths now as the verdict formed without being said aloud ever. When Marcus ended the session he said, "We will deliberate." Vanessa stood and looked at me like a stranger. She said, "You were never this." I replied, "I was always this." She shook her head and said, "You're cruel." I answered, "I'm accurate." Lily smiled. Ethan exhaled. Rachel gathered papers. Vanessa whispered, "They'll forget you." I said, "They won't forget this." She laughed weakly. "You think you're strong." I replied, "I think I'm seen." The door opened, and people filed out without looking at her as the hallway filled with low steps and soft talk now that faded fast alone. Outside Ethan said, "I'm sorry." I replied, "Don't be." Lily said, "You handled it." I answered, "I told it." Marcus walked by and said, "We'll follow process." I nodded. Vanessa stood by the wall and stared at the floor. She whispered, "You did this." I said, "You chose this." She shook her head. "You were mine." I replied, "I was never owned." She covered her face. "I'm finished." I said, "You're responsible." Silence wrapped us. I waited. She didn't look up. I turned away and didn't stop as steps carried me down the corridor in calm lines now alone here. Later Marcus announced the review. People watched. Vanessa was absent. Ethan said, "She didn't come." Lily said, "She can't." Rachel said, "We have enough." I nodded. The screen showed findings. The room stayed still. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I listened. Marcus said, "We will act." I said, "Thank you." Lily squeezed my hand. Ethan breathed out. The karma wasn't loud. It was quiet and final. I met the moment and let it pass without chasing it again as the chapter closed and the truth stayed standing by itself in clean light for all to see now at last. She waited in the small conference room when I arrived, hands folded, eyes red, posture small. I closed the door and stood near the window. She whispered, thank you for coming. I said, say what you need. She nodded and said, I underestimated you. I replied, I know. She flinched and said, I didn't think you could stand. I said, I always could. She swallowed and said, I'm scared. I answered, that's new. She shook her head and said, it isn't. I said, it was hidden. She looked down and said, I was wrong. I said, you were controlling. She whispered, I thought it was love. I replied, it was fear. She breathed in and said, I lost everything. I said, you lost control. She looked up and said, I lost you. I met her eyes and said, you didn't lose me. You never had me. She froze and then nodded slowly. I know, she said. I leaned against the table and waited. She asked, do you hate me? I said, no. She asked, do you forgive me? I said, I don't owe you that. She winced and said, fair. I said, honest. She pressed her palms together and said, I watched you and thought you were weak. I replied, you watched what I let you see. She said, I mocked you. I answered, I noticed. She said, I took credit. I answered, I tracked it. She said, I used you. I answered, I learned. She said, I was jealous. I answered, I saw it. She said, I needed you. I answered, you needed control. She said, I loved you. I answered, you loved power. She nodded and said, both can be true. I said, not for me. She bit her lip and said, I didn't think you would leave. I said, I didn't think I would stay. She whispered, I'm empty. I said, you're accountable. She looked away and said, they're removing me. I said, they're protecting the company. She asked, are you taking my role? I said, I'm taking mine. She laughed softly and said, you always had it. I said, you always blocked it. She sighed and said, I was afraid you would shine. I said, I was afraid you would break. She said, you were right. I said, so were you. She frowned and asked, how? I said, you saw my patience. She said, I thought it was weakness. I said, it was restraint. She nodded and said, I couldn't stand not being needed. I said, that's the work. She looked at me and said, will you stay? I said, no. She asked, will you help? I said, I won't rescue. She whispered, will you listen? I said, I am. She took a breath and said, I am afraid of the quiet. I said, sit with it. She said, I don't know how. I said, learn. She looked at the floor and said, I am sorry. I said, I heard you. She asked, is that enough? I said, for you maybe. She said, for us? I said, there is no us. She nodded and said, I see. I said, good. She wiped her eyes and said, you changed. I said, I returned. She said, you're cold. I said, I'm clear. She said, you're strong. I said, I'm steady. She said, you're leaving. I said, I am. She stood and said, wait. I paused. She said, say it again. I asked, say what? She said, that line. I said, you didn't lose me. She finished, you never had me. I nodded. She closed her eyes. It hurts, she said. I replied, it ends. She asked, can we be kind? I said, we can be honest. She smiled sadly and said, then be honest. I said, you scared me. She whispered, I know. I said, you boxed me in. She said, I did. I said, you taught me to hide. She said, I did. I said, you don't get to decide who I am. She said, I don't. I said, you don't get to keep me small. She said, I won't. I said, you don't get to follow me. She said, I won't. I said, you don't get to own me. She said, I never did. I nodded. She asked, what do you want? I said, peace. She asked, with me? I said, without you. She exhaled and said, I understand. I said, I hope you do. She looked at the door and said, if I go, will you watch? I said, I will walk. She said, if I fall. I said, get up. She said, if I fail. I said, try again. She said, if I call. I said, don't. She smiled thinly and said, fair. I said, final? She took a step back and said, you were never weak. I said, I was quiet. She said, I mistook it. I said, many do. She nodded and said, I see you. I said, that's enough. She opened the door and paused. Goodbye, she said. I said, goodbye. She walked out. I stayed. Then I turned and left. I counted the steps to the exit and heard her breathing behind me. She said, wait, and I said, no. She said, I will change, and I said, you will try. She said, I will fail, and I said, then learn. She said, I will be alone, and I said, then meet yourself. She said, I will be angry, and I said, then write. She said, I will be quiet, and I said, then listen. She said, I will remember you, and I said, then let go. She said, I will miss you, and I said, then heal. She said, I will hope, and I said, then work. She said, I will wait, and I said, then move. She said, I will try again, and I said, then begin. She said, good luck, and I said, goodbye. I opened the door, felt the light, and walked into it alone now. I walked into the lobby and felt the quiet settle around me. The receptionist smiled and said, good morning. I said, morning. She added, they're waiting. I nodded and said, I'm ready. The elevator doors opened and I stepped in alone. My phone buzzed and Ethan wrote, congrats. I typed, for what? He replied, you know. I smiled and put the phone away. The doors closed and the numbers climbed. I breathed and let my shoulders drop. For the first time in months I wasn't bracing. I was present. Marcus stood when I entered and said, have a seat. Rachel nodded and said, good to see you. Lily smiled and whispered, you did it. I said, we did. Ethan grinned and said, look at you. I asked, look at me how? He said, standing. I nodded and sat. Marcus cleared his throat and said, the board has decided. I listened. Rachel folded her hands. Lily held her breath. Ethan leaned in. Marcus said, effective immediately, you will lead the unit. I blinked. He added, interim at first, then permanent pending review. I said, thank you. He nodded. Rachel said, congratulations. Lily whispered, yes. Ethan laughed softly. Marcus continued, your work will guide the next phase. I said, I'll earn it. He replied, you already have. Rachel added, your record is clean. I said, so is my intent. Marcus smiled. Lily asked, when do you start? Marcus said, now. Ethan clapped once. I shook my head and said, no speeches. They laughed. I stood and said, let's work. Marcus nodded. Rachel closed her folder. Lily rose. Ethan followed. In the hallway Ethan said, you're promoted. I replied, I'm responsible. He said, same thing. I said, different weight. Lily said, you carry it well. I answered, I carry it awake. She smiled. My phone buzzed again. A message from Nina read, she's gone. I asked, from where? Nina replied, from the company. I closed my eyes and said, okay. Lily asked, everything okay? I said, yes. Ethan asked, Vanessa. I nodded. He said, I'm sorry. I replied, don't be. Lily asked, do you need a minute? I said, I have a lifetime. At my desk I found it cleared and waiting. A new badge lay on top. Ethan whistled. Lily laughed. I picked it up and said, it's just plastic. She said, it's recognition. I replied, it's responsibility. She nodded. Rachel stopped by and said, HR will update you. I said, thank you. She added, your engagement file is closed. I paused. She looked at me and said, by request. I said, mine? She nodded. Ethan went quiet. Lily placed her hand on my arm. I said, it's done. Later, Marcus called me in and said, how are you? I said, clear. He asked, any regrets? I replied, only staying small. He nodded. Good, he said. Keep that, he added. I said, I will. He leaned back and said, we value steadiness. I answered, so do I. He smiled. Then we agree, he said. I stood and said, thank you for trusting me. He replied, thank you for trusting yourself. I left with my head level. In the break room, Ethan raised a cup and said, to you. I shook my head and said, to work. Lily laughed. Ethan said, always the same. I replied, always awake. They drank. My phone buzzed again. A final message from Vanessa read, "Good luck." I stared at it and said, "Goodbye." I didn't send it. I put the phone face down. Lily asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am." Ethan asked, "Really?" I said, "Yes." At noon the team gathered. I said, "We move forward." Someone asked, "Without her?" I answered, "With clarity." Another asked, "With you?" I replied, "With us." They nodded. Rachel announced, "Process will be clean." I said, "It will be fair." Marcus added, "It will be quiet." I smiled. By afternoon emails slowed. The building felt lighter. I sat and worked. Lily passed and said, "You're different." I asked, "How?" She said, "Calm." I replied, "Clear." Ethan leaned on the door and said, "Drinks?" I said, "No." He raised a brow. I added, "Dinner?" He grinned. "Late," he said. On the way out the guard said, "Have a good night." I said, "You too." The street was cool and open. I breathed. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I walked. Ethan said, "Proud of you." I answered, "Proud of me." Lily said, "You earned it." I replied, "I chose it." They nodded. At the corner Ethan asked, "What now?" I said, "Home." Lily asked, "And after?" I said, "Me." They smiled. When we parted Ethan said, "See you, boss." I said, "See you, friend." Lily said, "Good night." I said, "Good night." I walked alone and felt no rush to fill the space. I wasn't loud. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't small. I was awake. I chose myself. I kept walking. I kept breathing. I kept being. I smiled. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The night held steady. So did I. It was enough. I said nothing to the passing cars and let their lights move on. I listened to my steps and felt each one land with purpose. I remembered the man I hid and thanked him for waiting. I met the man I am and promised him honesty. I chose quiet strength over noise, patience over panic, and truth over fear. I went home, unlocked the door, and let the day end. I sat, breathed, and rested. I was free, respected, and present. I did not celebrate, I simply lived. I chose myself again and again and again. I stopped.